The first symmetrical arm balance we're going to briefly talk about is, I think, one of the more commonly taught ones, which is Bakasana, or crow pose. I'd like to start with this one because the other symmetrical arm balances we're going to talk about, including Bhujapidasana, arm pressure pose, and Titibasana, or firefly pose, the muscle actions are very similar across all of them. So Bakasana, or crow pose, is really like shoulders and core and wrists. That's what it is. And it's a super wrist stretch. All of these are, because when you're in the pose, it's not like this, where your shoulder is directly on top of your wrist. It's gonna be more like this. Like on the floor, your shoulder is gonna be forward of your wrist, which brings your hand into like maximum extension. And of course, depends on how much extension you have to work with. So you need to warm up your wrists first. You need to have spent some time on your wrists beforehand in planks, shifting back and forth on your wrists in tabletop, wrist circles. The wrists we can't ignore or neglect. In terms of preparing, all the preparatory poses we did for the other inversions are helpful here because it's shoulders and core and wrists. So especially the plank plus, the serratus push-up movements, those are super helpful to get that rounded idea and that the pushing muscles really strong. And you can also be creative with core work because there is a lot of core involved here. So in the second class that we did, I had us lie down on our backs with the knees open, and we basically did some sit-ups with the legs like that, basically to mirror the shape of Bhujapidasana, which we were going to go into later. So just core work, wrist strengthening, and then the shoulder strengthening movements. So in crow pose, there are two ways to do it. One with the knees closer together, and you basically make a shelf out of your upper arms. And then another way to actually utilize more of your inner thigh and adductor strength to basically squeeze the legs. And that squeezing of the legs into the arms also comes into play into other arm balances like Bhujapidasana and other asymmetrical arm balances as well. So in crow, I would squat down like this and make contact. Just feel that I could lean forward and make contact with my knees into my upper arms, like high up into my armpits. And that might be one of the first kramas stages that I practice crow pose in. And then the next step, once you're here, I'm rising up off of my heels, would be to play with this leaning forward idea. And we did a lot of this with the other inversions. It's a lot of like forward movement this way. And again, as I was talking about with the other inversions, sometimes people don't know how to counter that and they just kind of plop forward onto their head. And the way to counter that is not only with your core strength and like lifting your legs up tight into your abdomen, but it's your hands, it's your fingertips, and you push your fingertips into the mat. Like you can't see that you're doing that necessarily, but that's gonna help you not plunk forward. If you're worried about plunking forward, then you could always set up a pillow at home or a stack of blankets or a yoga blanket in front of you. If you think your head is gonna plop forward onto the floor, at least you have a soft landing. So I would squat, make contact with the back of my arms, lean forward. I have to lean a lot. I can shift forward and back, forward and back. And then I'm rounding. Like, let me take away my legs. Do you see how rounded my back is? It's like a big C shape here. That's what I need. Shifting forward, and I go forward enough and round my back enough that maybe I start to play with lifting one foot off the floor and then the other. So we might say like, this is krama number 1, this is krama number 2, leaning. Krama number 3 would be the leaning, rounding, and lifting one foot at a time. And then to get into full crow, obviously, you would have to really lean, lift one leg, keep tucking it, and then lift the other one as well. And the big toes can come together, my arms are bent. It's like a lot of arms. It's a lot of arms and shoulder strength This version of Bakasana or crow pose can not be as comfortable in the back of the arms. I've heard that complaint a lot. You could try crow pose with your knees wider, kind of like what we were doing in class, coming into more of like this squat position. And instead of resting the arms on the back, you actually squeeze the legs on the outside. You might not get that same bony discomfort of the knee in the back of the arm. Exact same thing, squatting down, rounding, leaning forward, and this time I gotta squeeze too. I gotta squeeze in with my legs, round, doming, leaning, really tucking my legs up close, whoops. And then setting my feet down to lower. You can also use blocks as a way to prop your feet up if you want to get a little bit more height and actually get the feeling of crow pose without actually having to lift your feet up. You would have your blocks at their lowest height, 1 or 2 of them, and you would squat down on these blocks, right? So I already have this much head start. And then when I go to make contact and lean forward, I'm basically in it. I'm gonna basically be in the pose. It feels just as difficult, and I could practice lifting my feet off of these blocks. And then of course to come down, you would just squat back down onto the blocks, get the weight out of your hands, and then carefully step back off of them. It's one of the more simple arm balances to understand. That doesn't mean that it's easy at all. My biggest tips are to lean forward a lot and to use the fingertips. Bhuja Pidasana or arm pressure pose is pretty similar to that in the upper body. It's like exactly the same, except you're wrapping the legs around the arms, walking the feet in the front, and basically hooking the feet together. That's what we did in the second class, or played with in the second class. That is obviously a lot of inner thigh strength as well, but I think one of the keys to staying in Bhuja Pidasana when you're trying to like walk the feet like this and hook them and not fall back on your bum is to keep leaning forward. So let me show you. You would come into this Malasana squat type of thing. And now we got to flex our back more. We have to round our back more to create this shelf for our legs. I just have to walk my arms back through my legs, taking them wide again, cupping the backs of my feet, my heels. And you might need to step your feet out even wider and sitting back just until you can feel the backs of the thighs and your knees make contact with your arms and you sit. So what can be tough about this is, well, how am I going to hook my feet together and not just plop back down onto the floor? And the answer is, once you have sat down and created that shelf, I wouldn't stay seated as low as this. I would lift the bum up somewhat, which of course is like you're doing a squat. It's leg work. And then you're going to start to walk your feet closer together. You can sit back on your arms more at that point. So from the front, taking my arms under, sitting back, just kind of getting my bearings, getting comfortable. And then I'm going to lift up a little bit just to walk my feet close. Then I'm going to settle back in onto my arms. And I'm still pushing into my hands. I could just kind of lift my feet up here. So I've already got that stable shelf. But then I could really try to keep walking my feet towards each other, and that helps my legs to squeeze around my arms, hence arm pressure pose. And then it's like, okay, well then what now? How do I get off the floor from here? With your feet hooked like that, if you can't attain that, with them connected as a unit, you would actually push them forward. You would push your feet forward towards your face, and it actually like locks the legs around your arms like that. And then you can release, shift up, and do some wrist stretches for sure after that. Hands under the feet or just wrist flexion and wrist circles. So again, coming down, it's like the same thing my arms are doing in crow. I just have to like get them through my hips,
more, which means I have to round my back more. I'm pushing my arms outwards into my legs as I sit down. I gotta walk my feet in without plunking back, so my head keeps going forward. I'm gonna hook my feet together, and I'm gonna push my interlocked feet forward. So like there's a lot of forward movement here, okay? Bring the feet down, uncross, free the arms, and you can plunk back, or then you would move on in the sequence like we did. There are a lot of arm balances that use that leg over the arm idea as a shelf, like firefly pose, like 8-angle pose, like Ekapada Kaundinyasana pose, which we can go over too. To get used to that feeling, you could sit in Dandasana, staff pose, which we also did in that class, without having to have all this strength work in your shoulders involved. Just sitting, taking one leg at a time up, cradling it as we did, and playing with this feeling, playing with the idea of being able to create a shelf out of your own arm for your leg. And this is a setup for another arm balance pose, an asymmetrical one we'll talk about later. Also, we did in the class a lot of movements where we hooked the arm underneath the leg, like in Lizard, in Warrior One. So in Warrior One, we were getting used to this idea of the arm going underneath. And then in Lizard, that same thing. So there are places where you can play with that feeling of the arm going underneath the leg as a shelf. Titibasana, or firefly pose, you basically get into it most of the time from Bhuja Pidasana, from arm pressure pose. Because in Titibasana, both legs go over the arms at the same time, like they did in Bhuja Pidasana, but they're straight. Instead of the legs being hooked like this, they're extended straight out, which is just a lot of leg strength, quadriceps strength. That pose obviously really builds upon the foundations of crow pose, the rounded back, the strength in the front of the body, but now also the squeezing in of the inner thighs. And if we're gonna keep the legs straight over the arms, we have to have flexible hamstrings too. So in the class that we did the wide-legged forward fold first, and it was much later in the sequence, so we were warmed up. And you could have come down into that squat position from that wide-legged forward fold and played with Titibasana there. So do you remember in the sequence we were here, and then you could have come down, you know, and set up in that exact same way, either practicing Bhuja Pidasana or Titibasana. The principles of Titibasana are exactly the same, it's just a different leg variation, right? So you would have to basically go through that same process you did for Bhuja Pidasana, at least to this point. You would have taken the knees and the feet wide, probably with the feet turned open. You would have squat down and made that shelf. And this is where you might stop if you wanted to move into Titibasana. Firefly pose, you would sit down, create that shelf, and I'm pushing my arms out into my legs as I sit back. And then from here, your challenge is again not to plunk back and to get the legs extended out. There's a lot of forward energy in this pose too. Let me show you. Like I can sit back, make this shelf, and be, you know, pretty free, but you see how I plunk back? There needs to be something that's gonna send me forward. My extension through the legs is gonna help me to achieve that, as well as pressing into my arms. So let me stretch my wrists, and I'm gonna try again and show you that. Gripping through the hands. I can take the legs up and just kind of hover. It's fine if they're not straight first. But then I gotta lean forward. I'm bending my arms, tipping forward, and then I can play with straightening my legs. It's all shoulders, and now my quads. I'm straightening, pressing through the legs. Of course, my core is working too, but I'm not really focusing on that. Focusing on my shoulders, my hands, and really pressing straight and strong through the legs. I would find other ways of playing with this shape in pieces too. Like I would do the wide-legged seated forward fold just to get that wide leg feeling and idea and get that deep hip flexion that these poses are asking you for without, again, spending like a ton of time on the wrists in all of your trials. I would practice the pose in pieces, break down what the legs are doing, what the shoulders are doing, and then find ways of workshopping that. So for Titibasana, for example, I could sit with my legs open about how they would be, right? And then all of these poses really ask a lot of hip flexion, which is happening right here, right? This is all hip flexion. But we can also get into it by going forward. So you can practice your wide-legged forward bend as well as a preparation for Titibasana, and it will let you know, the ability that you can extend your legs out. Like if you can only do this pose like this, again, that's totally fine, but this might be how your Titibasana legs are gonna be too. Again, you can practice the seated leg shelf as well. And this could be a way to practice half Bhujapidasana, like half arm pressure pose, or half Titibasana with the leg extended. And this can become an entrance into 8-angle pose later as well. But in class, we were practicing lifting up with or without blocks. And I was trying to show you in the class how you couldn't sit like this. You have to really round in these poses. You have to round your back to get that forward movement and come down. Like I can sit, I know I have the strength to do it, and I know I understand the physics of it, but I can't just sit back like this and lift up. Like I can't, I have to lean forward. I've got to lean forward and also move my hands forward. And then I can use the strength of my arms and come up. And you can practice just that one leg, right? Pressing it into your arm. I would use the sequence that I created as a way to practice these poses. I would go through the sequence, and if you want to practice crow, whenever we get to the Bhujapidasana part in the class, just do crow pose instead. Or if you want to really hone in on Titibasana, then just practice Titibasana at that part in class. To prepare us for the asymmetrical arm balances, I want to offer you another class for that. It will have some of the same elements as the class for the symmetrical arm balances, which really focuses on the core and the shoulders. In some of the asymmetrical arm balances, the hips and the legs are turned off to one side. And so I would like to give you another class which incorporates more twisting and more side opening, specifically opening of the sides around your waist so that you can more comfortably and easily move into these arm balances. Of course, doing both of these in one sitting in one day would be a lot. You might want to just practice the symmetrical arm balances. Maybe there's one in particular you are focused on and you can just workshop that one within the class at that point. Or just give yourself a day, 2 days, it depends on how your wrists and your shoulders feel in between, and then come into the asymmetrical arm balance class.